She had been hunting him for 4 years, following every lead, analyzing every piece of evidence, determined to finally give Catherine Hayes justice after 31 years. When the DNA results came back, Detective Rachel Morgan stared at the name on her screen and felt her world shatter. The killer wasn't some faceless stranger. It was William Morgan, her father, the man who had raised her and taught her right from wrong. And now she had to decide between family loyalty and the truth that would destroy everything. The fluorescent lights of the Harlington Police Department flickered with the same tired rhythm they had maintained for over 3 decades. Detective Rachel Morgan sat surrounded by banker boxes marked with faded evidence tags from 1992, each one containing fragments of a life violently cut short. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed. Her eyes remained fixed on a single photograph, a young woman with auburn hair, and a smile so bright it seemed to radiate warmth even through the faded emulsion. Catherine Hayes had been 24 years old in this picture, taken just 3 weeks before everything ended. She had been a second-grade teacher at Riverside Elementary, the kind of teacher whose classroom was always filled with laughter, whose students cried when the school year ended because they didn't want to leave. Parents fought to get their children into her class, knowing their kids would not only learn to read and write, but would discover that school could be a place of joy. Catherine had been engaged to Marcus Hayes, a young detective with the sheriff's department who was already making a name for himself. They had been planning an October wedding, had already put a deposit down on the community center, had sent out invitations with a fall theme. On the night of September 22, 1992, Catherine left her evening aerobics class at the YMCA at 8:15, waving goodbye to 3 friends who watched her walk to her car. Those friends would later tell investigators that Catherine had seemed completely normal that evening, laughing about the workout, talking about final alterations on her wedding dress. She climbed into her burgundy Honda Accord, started the engine, and drove out of the parking lot heading east toward her apartment on Maple Street. She never arrived home. Marcus called the police at 11:30 when Catherine hadn't answered her phone, which was completely unlike her because she was obsessively punctual and always called if she was going to be even 15 minutes late. The missing person investigation yielded frustratingly little evidence. Catherine's car was found the next morning, abandoned in a closed grocery store parking lot 3 miles from the YMCA, keys still in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat with her wallet, credit cards, and $43 completely untouched. 4 days later, a utility worker checking electrical issues in the industrial district noticed a broken window at an abandoned textile warehouse scheduled for demolition. When he climbed through to investigate, he found Catherine's body in what had once been the storage room, partially covered with canvas tarps. She had been strangled, and the medical examiner determined she had died within hours of her disappearance. Rachel had been 5 years old when Catherine Hayes was murdered, young enough that she didn't fully understand what was happening, but old enough to sense the fear that gripped Harlington that autumn. She remembered how her mother suddenly started driving her to kindergarten instead of letting her walk. She remembered how her father installed new locks on all the doors and windows, how he sat her down and explained she needed to be careful about strangers. She remembered parents clustering together in tight groups at school pickup, talking in hushed voices. Doors that had always been unlocked were suddenly bolted shut. The case consumed the Harlington Police Department for years, generating hundreds of leads that ultimately led nowhere. Eventually, as cases do when they remain unsolved for too long, Catherine's file was relegated to the cold case archives. Just another tragedy without resolution, just another family left without answers. But Rachel Morgan had never forgotten Catherine Hayes. When she made detective 4 years ago after spending 8 years in patrol and investigations, Catherine's case was the first file she pulled from those dusty archives. What Rachel didn't know as she opened that file was that the evidence would lead her straight to the person she trusted most, the man who had raised her and whose name she carried. The DNA evidence collected in 1992 had been minimal and poorly preserved. Technology back then was primitive compared to modern forensic capabilities. The samples had degraded over decades, compromised by improper storage in a small-town department that had never handled a murder investigation of this magnitude. Every expert Rachel consulted during her first year working the case told her the same thing. The evidence was too compromised to yield any usable DNA profile. But Rachel had inherited her father's stubbornness. She sent those samples to 7 different laboratories across the country, begging forensic scientists to try experimental extraction techniques to push the boundaries of what was possible. 6 labs confirmed what she feared, returning reports explaining why the samples were essentially useless. But the 7th lab, a cutting-edge facility in Virginia, specializing in extracting DNA from the most challenging samples, called her 3 weeks ago with news that made her hands shake so violently she nearly dropped her phone. They had successfully isolated and amplified a DNA profile using a revolutionary extraction method developed within the last 18 months. After 31 years, they finally had genetic evidence that could identify Catherine's killer. Rachel had sat at her desk with tears streaming down her face, thinking about Catherine's family who had waited so long, about Marcus Hayes who had never remarried and still kept Catherine's photograph on his desk, about all those years of dead ends that might finally be ending. She immediately submitted the profile to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. She checked it obsessively every few hours for 3 days, praying for a match. But there were no matches in the criminal database, which meant whoever killed Catherine had never been arrested for any crime serious enough to require DNA submission. She expanded her search to GED Match and other genealogical databases where people voluntarily upload ancestry DNA results. Again, nothing useful. For 3 weeks, Rachel felt that crushing disappointment familiar to cold case investigators, that sensation of getting close only to have the answer slip away. Then yesterday, her phone rang. Dr. Samuel Webb from the Virginia lab had been working with genetic genealogist Rebecca Torres, who specialized in building family trees from distant DNA matches. They had been working around the clock for 48 hours following a promising lead. What they were about to tell Rachel would change everything she thought she knew about her own family. Rebecca Torres explained that she had identified distant cousins whose DNA profiles created a pattern pointing toward one specific family line. She had meticulously traced that line backward through 5 generations using census records, newspaper archives, and church registries, building a comprehensive family tree. The work had been painstaking, requiring cross-referencing hundreds of historical documents and verifying each connection before moving forward. Eventually, after eliminating impossible branches and following the most promising leads, Rebecca arrived at a name that matched the DNA profile perfectly. A name that had access to the warehouse where Catherine's body was found. A name that explained why this case had never been solved despite years of investigation. When Rebecca spoke the name William Morgan, Rachel felt the entire world tilt sideways. She asked Rebecca to repeat it, thinking she must have misheard. But Rebecca had been thorough, had already verified that this William Morgan lived in Harlington in 1992, had been the right age, had owned Morgan commercial properties, and had business dealings with the textile warehouse where Catherine was discovered. The phone nearly slipped from Rachel's numb fingers. She managed to thank Rebecca and end the call, then sat in complete silence while the office emptied around her and the sun set outside. The man who had raised her, who had coached her softball team and walked her down the aisle at her wedding, that man had murdered Catherine Hayes. That man had strangled a young teacher and left her body in a warehouse. Rachel sat in the darkening office watching 36 years of memories crumble and reform into something unrecognizable. But the worst realization was still coming, because as Rachel began gathering corroborating evidence, she would discover that Catherine Hayes hadn't been her father's only victim. The photographs she would find hidden in his storage unit would reveal a pattern of stalking involving at least 15 women, and 3 of those women had never been found. Rachel's mind raced through her childhood with new and horrible clarity. September 1992. She had been 5 years old, excited about kindergarten, completely oblivious to the darkness in her father's life. Her mother, Margaret, had been 6 months pregnant with Rachel's brother, Nathan, dealing with morning sickness while her husband had been out murdering a young woman. Rachel remembered her father had been stressed during that period, more irritable than usual, spending long hours away supposedly dealing with complicated business negotiations. The warehouse where Catherine's body was found suddenly took on sinister significance. Rachel pulled up property records with shaking hands, already knowing what she would find. The abandoned Harlington Textiles building had been owned by Southwest Holdings, a subsidiary of Morgan Commercial Properties. Her father hadn't just had access to that warehouse. He had owned it. He had the keys. He had been there multiple times during the weeks before Catherine disappeared. Rachel thought about Catherine's family and felt nauseating waves of grief. Catherine's parents had both died without knowing who killed their daughter, had spent their final years carrying that burden of uncertainty. Her younger sister, Grace Patterson, was now 52, still lived in Harlington, still visited Catherine's grave every Sunday, still waited for justice 31 years overdue. Then there was Marcus Hayes, who had discovered Catherine's body after joining the search. Marcus had been 27 then, full of promise, planning a life with the woman he loved. Finding Catherine's body had fundamentally changed him. He had never married, never even come close. He was now 58, still working homicide, still keeping Catherine's photograph on his desk, still living alone in the same apartment he had been planning to move out of when they got married. And there was Rachel's mother, perhaps the cruelest aspect of what Rachel had discovered. Margaret Morgan was 68 now, living in Desert Rose Memory Care Facility, her mind disappearing into vascular dementia. On good days, Margaret could remember Rachel's name. On bad days, she thought it was still 1995 and asked when William was coming home from work, forgetting he had died 12 years ago. Rachel was going to have to decide whether to tell her mother the truth or let her live out her declining years, believing she had been married to a good man. Rachel looked at Catherine's photograph again, really looked at it without denial clouding her judgment. She saw a young woman who had been loved deeply, who had dreams and plans and a future violently stolen from her. She saw a victim who deserved justice regardless of how painful that truth might be. Catherine had spent her last day teaching second graders cursive writing, helping struggling students, planning lessons for the following week she would never teach. She had gone to aerobics and laughed with friends, had driven toward home thinking about her upcoming wedding, and then William Morgan had intercepted her, lured her to that warehouse with some pretext that seemed innocent, and killed her. Rachel picked up her phone with a trembling hand. Her finger hovered over Captain James Reynolds' number. Once she made this call, everything would change irrevocably. Her father's name would be destroyed. The elementary school wing named in his honor would be stripped of his name. The scholarship fund would be dissolved. Her family would shatter in ways that might never heal. Her brother Nathan would probably never forgive her. Her extended family would see her as a traitor. The Morgan name, which had meant something in Harlington for 40 years, would become synonymous with murder. But Catherine Hayes deserved the truth. Her family deserved closure. And Rachel Morgan, despite the blood in her veins, was a detective first. She pressed the call button. Captain James Reynolds arrived within minutes, his weathered face grim. He was 3 years from retirement, had been a rookie officer when Catherine was murdered. Rachel showed him the email, watched as his expression shifted from confusion to shock to pity. Reynolds had known her father, had played golf with him, had shared drinks at Rotary Club meetings. "We need to verify this before we move forward," Reynolds said carefully. "This is going to destroy a lot of people, Rachel. We need to be absolutely certain." Rachel nodded, understanding what he really meant. They needed corroborating evidence beyond the DNA match. They needed to build a case that would satisfy not just the legal system, but the court of public opinion that would judge them all. Over the next 5 days, Rachel did something she never imagined she would do. She investigated her own father with the same thoroughness she brought to every case. And what she would discover in his hidden storage unit would reveal that Catherine Hayes was just one victim in a pattern of predatory behavior lasting years. Rachel pulled her father's financial records from 1992, his phone logs, his travel receipts from his old accounting firm's archives. She interviewed his former business associates with questions that seemed innocuous, but were carefully designed to establish his whereabouts on September 22nd. She visited the storage unit where her mother had moved boxes of William's belongings before moving to memory care. The unit was filled with the accumulation of a life: business records, golf trophies, Rachel's childhood art projects, Nathan's Little League uniforms, family photograph albums. Then, hidden behind boxes of Christmas decorations, Rachel discovered a locked metal file cabinet she had never seen before. It required bolt cutters to open, and Rachel's heart pounded because she knew whatever was inside had been deliberately hidden. The metal door screeched open. Inside, Rachel found 3 items that would fundamentally change her understanding of who William Morgan had been. First, her father's day planner from 1992, leather-bound with his name embossed in gold. Rachel flipped through with shaking hands, seeing appointments with clients, notes about inspections, family obligations. And there on September 22nd was an entry that made her blood run cold. 8:30 p.m., Harlington Property, Warehouse District, meet KH. KH Catherine Hayes. Her father had scheduled a meeting with Catherine on the night she disappeared, at the exact location where her body would be found. The second item would prove this hadn't been spontaneous violence but carefully premeditated murder. And the third item would reveal that her father had been stalking at least 15 women over years. 3 of those women had disappeared and were never found. The second item was a folder containing credit card receipts. September 19, 1992, 3 days before Catherine disappeared, her father had visited Burke's Hardware. The itemized receipt listed his purchases: 50 feet of nylon rope, heavy-duty plastic sheeting, industrial cleaning solution, work gloves, utility knife, duct tape. At the time, he had claimed these were for property repairs. But knowing what Rachel now knew, those purchases took on sinister significance. Her father had gone to that hardware store 3 days before Catherine disappeared and bought exactly what someone would need to commit murder and clean up afterward. This hadn't been a crime of passion. This had been planned. The third item made Rachel walk outside to get fresh air because she thought she might vomit. The shoebox contained photographs, dozens of Polaroids that had faded over years but were still clear enough to see what they depicted. Surveillance photographs of women, clearly taken without knowledge or consent. Women walking to cars after work. Women leaving buildings. Women at grocery stores going about their daily lives, completely unaware someone was watching, following, documenting their routines. The photographs had a predatory quality that made Rachel's skin crawl. She forced herself to go through them methodically, documenting each one, trying to identify the women. Some were labeled on the back with first names and dates, spanning from the mid-1980s through the mid-2000s. And there, in the middle of the stack, were multiple photographs of Catherine Hayes that made Rachel's stomach turn. Her father had photographed Catherine leaving Riverside Elementary, arms full of books, face animated talking with another teacher. He had photographed her getting into her Honda in the school parking lot. He had photographed her walking into the YMCA for aerobics, wearing the bright teal leotard mentioned in witness statements. He had photographed her at the Harlington Community Center, presumably before or after ESL classes. The photographs documented obsession, stalking behavior that had clearly escalated. Rachel counted at least 15 different women in that shoebox. With shaking hands, she called the cold case database requesting a search. All missing persons cases, Harlington and surrounding counties within 50 miles. Timeframe 1985 to 2011. Female victims, ages 20 to 35. The results came back within an hour. 7 women had gone missing in that geographic area and timeframe under suspicious circumstances. 7 women who had vanished without trace. Rachel compared the database results to her father's photographs. 3 of them matched. 3 missing women were in William Morgan's secret collection, their faces captured on film months or weeks before they disappeared forever. Catherine Hayes might not have been her father's first victim. The evidence suggested she might not have been his last. Rachel was looking at what appeared to be decades-long predatory behavior by a serial killer who had operated in plain sight, hiding behind the respectable facade of a successful businessman. She called Captain Reynolds. "I need you at Desert View Storage right now. Bring the entire evidence response team." "Captain, it's so much worse than we thought." By sunset, the storage unit was crawling with forensic technicians in white Tyvek suits, carefully documenting and collecting evidence. The surveillance photos were being compared against missing persons databases. Financial records were being analyzed for patterns, and Rachel was giving a formal recorded statement about discovering the evidence, knowing this statement might be played in courtrooms and examined by lawyers. But there was one more thing Rachel needed to do before this went any further, and it was perhaps the hardest thing she had ever done. She needed to tell Grace Patterson, Catherine's younger sister, that they had finally identified the killer. She needed to look Grace in the eye and tell her the man who murdered her sister was Rachel's own father. Rachel drove to Grace's house that evening. Grace still lived in the modest ranch where she had grown up with Catherine, the same house where their parents had waited desperately for news back in 1992. When Rachel knocked on the door at 7:30, Grace answered with a cautious smile that faded instantly, seeing Rachel's expression. "You found something," Grace said quietly. Not a question, but a statement. They sat in Grace's living room, which was essentially a shrine to Catherine's memory. Photographs covered the walls documenting every phase of Catherine's too short life. School pictures, family vacations, college graduation, engagement photos with Marcus Hayes, both of them young and radiantly happy. "We identified Catherine's killer," Rachel said, forcing the words out. "The DNA evidence was conclusive. After 31 years, we know who murdered your sister." Grace's hands flew to her mouth, tears immediately streaming down her face. She stared at Rachel, waiting for the name she had been waiting 31 years to hear. "It was my father, William Morgan. The DNA match is definitive, and we found corroborating evidence that confirms it." Color drained from Grace's face. She sat back hard, mouth opening and closing as she tried to process information that somehow explained so much. For several minutes, neither woman spoke. "William Morgan," Grace finally repeated slowly. "The real estate developer. The man everyone said was so civic-minded." Her voice hardened. "I met him. At Catherine's funeral. I was 21 and I stood in that receiving line for 6 hours. Your father came through. He shook my parents' hands. He told them how tragic it was. My mother cried on his shoulder. He donated $5,000 for funeral expenses." Grace's voice broke. "He stood at my sister's funeral, knowing exactly what he had done. He looked my parents in the eye and lied with such sincerity they were grateful for his kindness." How do you murder someone and then comfort their family? Rachel felt physically sick. Her mother had mentioned years ago how affected William had been, how he had donated money to help. The calculated cruelty was breathtaking. "There's more," Rachel said quietly. "We found evidence that Catherine might not have been his only victim. Surveillance photographs of at least 15 women. 3 went missing and were never found. We're working with multiple jurisdictions." Grace's eyes widened. 15 women. 3 missing. Your father was a serial killer. The words hung in the air, making it real in a way it hadn't quite been before. Not just a murderer who killed once in rage, but a predator who had hunted multiple victims over years. Then Grace said something that made Rachel's blood freeze. "I need to tell you something I've never told anyone. Not even the police in 1992. Something I've regretted every day since." Rachel leaned forward. 2 weeks before Catherine died, she came to my apartment. It was late, after 9, which was unusual because Catherine was always in bed by 10 on school nights. She was upset, shaken. She said a student in her ESL class was making her uncomfortable. Rachel's heart began to pound. She said he had seemed normal at first, just another adult wanting to improve his English. But over weeks, he started acting differently, arriving early, waiting for her in hallways, staying after class, finding excuses to keep her talking, standing too close, finding ways to touch her hand or shoulder in what he tried to make seem innocent, asking personal questions about her life, her fiancé, her wedding, her routine. Grace's voice trembled. Catherine said she tried to maintain professional boundaries, tried to gently redirect conversation, tried to keep physical distance, but he wasn't taking hints. She said there was something about the way he looked at her that made her skin crawl, even though he hadn't done anything she could point to as clearly inappropriate. It was just a feeling, an instinct. "Did she tell you his name?" Rachel asked, though she already knew. "William," she said his name was William. She described him as educated, well-dressed, in his 40s, probably successful. She said he seemed like he should be a nice man, which made her doubt her instincts. She felt guilty for wanting him removed when he hadn't technically done anything wrong. Grace looked directly at Rachel with tears streaming, and I told her she was overreacting. I told her she was probably imagining things because she was stressed about the wedding. I told her he was probably just a lonely immigrant trying to make conversation, that she should be nice because that's what good teachers do. I told her not to make a big deal, that she was being oversensitive. Grace's voice broke completely. 2 weeks later, she was dead, and I've spent 31 years knowing I sent my sister back to her killer. I told her to ignore her instincts. If I had listened, if I had taken her seriously, maybe she would still be alive. Rachel moved to sit beside Grace, putting her arm around the older woman's shaking shoulders. Grace, this was not your fault. Men like my father don't stop because of rejection or a change of instructor. They escalate. They find other opportunities. He was going to kill her either way because that's what predators do. They held each other and cried, two women bound by the same tragedy from completely different angles. The press conference was held 3 days later in the main briefing room at Harlington Police Department. The room was packed with reporters from local stations, Phoenix and Tucson outlets, and national news organizations. Rachel stood at the podium with Grace beside her, Captain Reynolds on her other side. Rachel looked directly into the cameras, her voice clear and unwavering. "Thank you for coming. I'm Detective Rachel Morgan with the Harlington Police Department. I'm here to announce a significant development in the 1992 murder of Catherine Hayes, a case that has remained unsolved for 31 years. Using advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, we have conclusively identified the individual responsible for Catherine's death." She paused. "The DNA evidence has been verified by multiple independent laboratories and corroborated by substantial physical evidence. The individual responsible was William Morgan, a Harlington businessman who died in 2011. The room erupted with shouted questions, but Rachel held up her hand. "I want to acknowledge that William Morgan was my father. This has been the most difficult investigation of my career, but I want to be absolutely clear. The evidence is overwhelming and conclusive. My relationship to the suspect does not change the facts or diminish the horror of what he did." Rachel detailed the evidence: the day match, the day planner entry, the hardware store purchases, the surveillance photographs. She explained the timeline with professional precision, never allowing emotion to creep into her voice. "My father was a murderer who took Catherine Hayes' life and denied her family justice for over 3 decades. He presented one face to the community while hiding something monstrous. The fact that he was my father does not change what he did. It does not excuse it. It does not diminish it. Catherine deserves justice, and today, finally, she has it." The questions were brutal. Reporters demanded to know how Rachel could have missed the signs, whether she had suspected, whether this called into question her previous investigations. Rachel answered each with steady honesty, never deflecting, never making excuses. Beside her, Grace spoke about Catherine with love and grief that had not diminished over 31 years. She described the vibrant young woman who had loved teaching, who had dreamed of opening her own school, who had been 3 weeks from marrying the love of her life. Then Grace publicly thanked Rachel for her courage. Detective Morgan could have buried this evidence when she found those photographs and receipts. She could have protected his memory, but she didn't. She chose justice over loyalty. She chose my sister over her own comfort. That takes more courage than I can express. The story exploded across Arizona and then the nation. Detective solves sister's murder, discovers father was killer, became a headline that captured public imagination. Response was divided. Some praised Rachel's integrity, calling her a hero. Others questioned her competence, suggested she must have known, accused her of seeking attention. The department placed Rachel on administrative leave pending review of all her previous cases. She spent 6 weeks in limbo while investigators combed through every case she had worked. Her brother Nathan did not call, did not respond to attempts at communication, made clear through his attorney he wanted no contact. But Grace Patterson called every few days, checking in, offering support, sharing memories. Through these conversations, something unexpected developed. Genuine friendship built on shared tragedy, but growing into something that honored Catherine's memory without being consumed by it. The internal investigation concluded after 6 weeks. The review board found that Rachel had conducted her investigation with complete professional integrity, that every previous case was solid. She was reinstated with a formal commendation for courage and dedication to justice. But Rachel's life had fundamentally changed. Harlington removed William Morgan's name from the elementary school wing. The scholarship fund was dissolved. Funds transferred to a new foundation in Catherine Hayes' memory. His photograph was removed from every public place, his entire legacy erased in weeks. But Rachel kept one item from her father's belongings, something she had discovered in the very back of that storage unit and had not mentioned to anyone. 3 VHS tapes with dates corresponding to 3 of the murders. And on those tapes, Rachel had heard something that changed everything. A second voice, another man helping her father, which meant William Morgan's accomplice was still alive, still free, still hiding. The tapes had been wrapped in plastic, hidden in a duffel bag pushed into the storage unit's farthest corner, labeled simply with dates. September 20th, 1992, April 3rd, 1998, November 15th, 2003. Rachel had watched them once in a secure evidence room with the door locked. She would never watch them again. The tapes showed murders, not Catherine specifically, but 2 other women from his victim list. The footage was grainy and dark, clearly filmed with handheld camera and poor lighting. Rachel had watched with professional detachment, barely masking her horror as her father committed acts of violence. She documented every frame, cataloged every detail, prepared comprehensive reports for the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. But what truly shaken Rachel was the audio. In all 3 tapes, there was a second voice, a man's voice speaking from behind the camera or off to the side. The voice was deliberately disguised, run through electronic distortion that made it sound mechanical and inhuman. But the content made clear this person was not just filming, but actively participating, helping William Morgan, encouraging him. "Make sure you get the rope tight enough this time," the distorted voice said on the 1998 tape. "Did you remember the cleaning supplies?" the voice asked on the 2003 tape. "You need to be more careful about evidence," the voice advised. William Morgan had not been working alone. He had an accomplice, someone he trusted enough to involve in his darkest secrets, someone who had helped kill at least 3 women and possibly more. Rachel immediately turned the tapes to the FBI's Audio Analysis Unit, which had been working on identifying the speaker for months using sophisticated voice recognition software and acoustic analysis. The FBI determined the voice belonged to a male, probably white, likely between 40 and 60 at the time of recordings, with no discernible regional accent. The electronic distortion made identifying specific vocal characteristics nearly impossible. But analysts were working on filtering techniques that might reveal the original voice beneath the disguise. Rachel thought about that unknown accomplice every day. She created a dedicated case file, coordinated with FBI behavioral analysts to develop a profile, reviewed her father's life looking for clues about who he might have trusted with such terrible secrets. The accomplice would be in his 60s or 70s now if still alive. He might have stopped when William died, or he might still be hunting, still hiding. 8 months after the press conference, a break came from an unexpected source. A forensic audio specialist using cutting-edge AI technology managed to filter enough electronic distortion from the VHS tapes to identify unique vocal characteristics. The specialist compared these to voice samples from everyone in William Morgan's social and professional circle, running analysis through sophisticated pattern-matching algorithms. The computer identified a 93% probability match to Edward Callahan, who had been William Morgan's business attorney from 1987 until William's death in 2011. Callahan was now 72, still practicing law in Phoenix, still respected and successful, still hiding behind respectability's mask. Rachel stared at Edward Callahan's photograph, understanding with sickening clarity why he had never been seriously considered. He was a lawyer, an officer of the court, someone whose professional identity was built on law and justice. He had represented William in dozens of real estate transactions, had been present at family gatherings, had attended Rachel's college graduation. He had sent flowers when William died and handled the estate with professional efficiency, and he had been helping William Morgan kill women for over 2 decades. The investigation into Callahan took another 6 months of careful work. They obtained warrants for his financial records, phone logs, travel history. They put him under surveillance. They discovered Callahan owned a cabin in the mountains north of Phoenix, a remote property he visited frequently but had never mentioned in professional or social contexts. A search warrant revealed a soundproof basement room containing photographic equipment, recording devices, and disturbing trophies from victims spanning 3 decades. Edward Callahan was arrested on a Tuesday morning as he arrived at his law office, charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. He did not resist, simply smiled slightly as handcuffs were placed on his wrists. "Tell Rachel I said hello," Callahan said to arresting officers. "Tell her she did well." Her father would have been proud. The trial lasted 4 months and dominated national media. Rachel testified about evidence found in her father's storage unit, about the VHS tapes, about the voice that led them to Callahan. She sat through days of testimony describing horrific crimes, maintaining professional composure even as her heart broke for every victim and family. Edward Callahan was convicted on 18 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. At 72, he would die behind bars, his respectable facade finally stripped away. After the verdict, Rachel walked out of the courthouse and found Grace waiting on the steps. They stood together in Arizona sunshine, two women who had spent years seeking justice, who had finally seen it delivered. "Catherine can rest now," Grace said quietly. "Really rest. Her killer has been exposed, his accomplice caught, and the whole truth told. That's all we ever wanted." Today, Rachel Morgan continues working cold cases, using lessons from the most difficult investigation of her career to help other families find closure. She has solved 23 additional cases in the 2 years since Catherine's case broke open. She speaks at law enforcement conferences, teaching investigators about following evidence wherever it leads, no matter how uncomfortable that destination. Catherine Hayes was 24 when she died on September 22, 1992. She was a teacher who changed children's lives, a daughter who brought joy to her parents, a sister who was Grace's best friend, a fiancée planning her future. She was a real person with dreams and plans and a whole life ahead of her, stolen by men who saw her as nothing more than prey. But because one detective had courage to follow evidence, even when it led to her own father, Catherine's story did not end in that warehouse in 1992. Her story ended with justice, with truth, with 18 families finally getting answers after years of uncertainty. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that truth matters and justice matters, and every victim deserves someone who will not give up, please engage with this content. Like this video to help share Catherine's story. Leave a comment about Rachel's impossible choice. Subscribe to hear more stories about cold cases that refuse to stay buried, about detectives who refuse to give up, about families who refuse to forget. And if you know something about an unsolved case, if you have information that could help bring closure to a family waiting for years or decades, please speak up. Come forward. Your information could unlock a case cold for 30 years. Your courage could give a family the peace they desperately seek. The Catherine Hayes Memorial Foundation continues funding DNA testing and investigative resources for cold cases. Information is in the description. Every case solved is another victory against darkness. Every family receiving closure is another reason to keep fighting. Catherine Hayes mattered. The 18 women William Morgan and Edward Callahan killed mattered. The countless other victims still waiting for justice, they matter too. Their lives had value. Their deaths deserve investigation. Their families deserve answers. Never stop demanding truth. Never stop fighting for justice. Never accept comfortable lies when uncomfortable truths are available. And never let the monsters win by choosing silence over courage. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about these victims whose stories might otherwise be forgotten. Thank you for never giving up on the belief that justice, even decades late, is always worth pursuing. Rachel Morgan chose truth over family loyalty. She chose justice over reputation. She chose Catherine Hayes over her own comfort. And because she made that impossible choice, 18 families finally have peace. Drop a comment telling me what you think about this case. Share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and let's make sure that these victims are never forgotten. See you in the next investigation.